Go ahead, Ben.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for having me here. I think the last time I spoke at this forum was pretty much the last thing I did before lockdown. So that's it's been about a year since I spoke. That was time was on Kautsky. This one today, German communism and the March action, so-called, of 1921. A derailed train is how we'll begin, and a derailed train is perhaps how we'll finish. Spoiler alert. So the March action, what are we going to look at today? First of all, a very brief backdrop to the events of March 1921, 100 years ago, pretty much to the day. A very brief outline of the events, because we are dealing with here a veritable kind of whodunit, a very difficult and complex series of events. That's why it's slightly misleading to refer to it as the March action. We'll talk about that later. A complex series of events that span a couple of weeks in March 100 years ago that will necessarily be slightly detailed, but I think it's important both as an introductory overview and as a way in to make more fundamental points and have more discussion, to provide something of an outline of what happened insofar as that is possible for reasons we'll discuss. Then to look at four overlapping causes, motivations, forces behind these events and how they unfolded: police provocation, developments within the Communist Party of Germany, the role of the Comintern, crucially the Executive Committee of Comintern and some of its representatives within Germany of the time, and the KAPD, the Communist Workers' Party of Germany, and the role that it played in these events as well. Then some brief thoughts on the aftermath, what I call as a kind of period of crisis and self-justification. Then a step back, or step forward perhaps, in terms of the some of the disputes and discussions within historiography on this question, on these questions, and possibly some potential for further research and insight into what was going on. And then I kind of hesitate to call them conclusions, because this is very much the beginning of research that I've started on these events, but some ideas at the end to throw in and maybe provide good occasion for discussion, some food for thought. Okay, so let's briefly talk about the backdrop. This is a train pulling in at the Leuna mining works in central Germany, which were key in the development of these actions, these strikes. I can't quite see my. There we go. That's better. The United Communist Party of Germany, as it's known at the time, the VKPD, recently merges with the left of the USPD in Halle, so the independent social democracy, the pro-Moscow left of that party, joins en masse in Halle in October 1920. I know a good book about that, if you would recommend one. And that sees the KPD, or the VKPD as it's known after these mergers, it sees the German Communist Party grow to become a mass force for the first time, really, because in its late foundation, New Year's Eve 1918-19, it is a marginal force. Largely, it doesn't participate in the elections. It doesn't really have much to go by in terms of membership and publications. But over time, it grows into a very large organization with real weight and influence in the German working class and within society, more German society more broadly. The region around Halle, so again, so we've got the Unity Congress in Halle, and the events around March 1921 actually take place quite close in and around Halle too. Today it's part of Saxony and Saxony-Anhalt, but back in the early days of the Weimar Republic, it's part of this enormous state of Prussia. It's Mitteldeutschland, central Germany, and is often referred to as kind of the beating red heart of German communism. It's where the party was by far its strongest. To illustrate this this fact, if we look at the state parliament elections for Prussia in 1921, the VKPD, the Communist Party, is the strongest party by some margin. Here are the votes it received in those elections: 197,000, compared to the SPD of 70,000 and the USPD, the Independent Social Democracy, of 74,000 votes. And really, that is a kind of inverse image, a mirror image of the national state of affairs and the relations between these parties. The KPD in the heart of central Germany is a very, very strong force indeed. This is a time, while it's referred to by Weimar historians as a period of relative stability, I think both the term relative and stability need to be taken with a pinch of salt. This is particularly in the central Germany. This is a region of great social unrest. As we'll see in a second, parts of Germany are occupied even at this stage. Reparations crisis, the post-war settlements, etc., etc. There are lots of things going on. Borders with Poland after the First World War. There's all sorts of questions thrown in to the general social question, the situation of the working class more generally in Germany, but also in the center of Germany, it tended to be a younger, less skilled, and less well-organized working class, which may or may not feed into what happened. That's just a general observation on the nature of the working class in this region, strongly built around mining, etc. And what is it? One of the motivating factors behind these set of events that are set in motion is that following the so-called Kapp-Luttwitz putsch of March 1920, when right-wing generals attempt a coup and the workers rise to oppose it in united action, armed united action, one of the important points to note here in terms of what happens in March 1921 is that in this region in particular, workers are still heavily armed after as a result of those events and haven't given up on their arms, etc. So that's worth noting at this stage. Forgive me for the slightly small writing and a lot of detail here, but I think it is just worth providing an overview of this, which has been known as an insurrection without insurrectionaries, a general strike without strikers, etc., etc. But let's just have a brief look at at some of the events and how they fit in. Looking ahead to something I'll say later on, involved in this entire process it's a complex series of events, sometimes quite difficult to reconstruct, and there's also the issue of unintended outcomes and the role of chance, as we'll see. 16th of March 1921, Otto Hersing, SPD politician in Prussia, announces that troops will occupy the Halle-Merseburg region, which is the focus of the March events. And then in an extraordinary meeting of the KPD leadership, a kind of crisis meeting held actually at the same time, the idea of the theory of offensive is discussed and it's agreed upon in some detail. Then they get the news of this mobilization of police forces into the region. And that kind of, again, the role of chance that plays out quite interestingly in how things develop. We'll look at that in a second. There's then a meeting with the regional leaders, so the KPD regional leaders in central Germany, and there's a bit of pushback from them. They're saying, well, actually, can we really be using this as an occasion to go on the offensive, to assert our own agenda here? How would that work? And there's a kind of compromise agreed to say, okay, definitely bring something into existence, bring a movement, bring the workers out if you can, but do it in such a way that we could also then just turn it off quickly if needed to, right? So that's a kind of compromise that's reached. And then on the 19th of March, coming up to almost exactly 100 years ago, so-called protection police, Schutzpolizei, enter the region. And again, this isn't just, the bobbies on the beat or having a quick kind of stroll. These are armed units flooding into the region. Die Rote Fahne, which is the daily newspaper of the Communist Party of Germany at the time, issues a national appeal. So it's not just to those in the regional newspaper. It's a national appeal. It says, worker, do you already own a weapon? Or do you wish us to stand aside when the great liberation struggle rises, which will lead the German proletariat to the side of the Russian heroes, to the side of the revolutionary proletariat of the whole world, for the final decisive struggle for the victory of the world revolution? Workers, wake up and wake those who are sleeping. Get hold of weapons. Death looms if you do not fight. So again, just placing that in the context, this is what's going on. I don't know whether there's a big mark over the screen there. This is the context. Police are sent into the region, and this is the appeal in Die Rote Fahne. Most interesting. And again, there's more pressure on the local leaders to say, these are, we need to use this now. your struggle, your defense here against this this move, this provocation, to create national, all-encompassing struggles and slogans like the one above, and make sure that this is a success. And indeed, it is the case that initially, 21st and 22nd of March, so yeah, 100 years ago, there is the call to strike action is largely followed, and is in and of itself slightly successful. And the KPD leadership at this point is kind of keen to say, okay, we don't want to escalate things before the Easter weekend, but we've got this successful action into force, into being. But there are then people are saying, well, what do we kind of do next? We've had this action, we've protested against it, what now? And then this is where things start to get a little bit complicated, and why the sources are sometimes contradictory or kind of self-justifying, as we'll see. But on the 22nd of March, so despite the kind of general mood amongst the leadership, Eberlein of the Zentrale, which isn't the same thing as the KPD leadership, but to all intents and purposes for this discussion, let's just leave it at that. He arrives in the area in Halle-Merseburg, and proposes that in order to push things forward, right, we now need to present this as, this is not just a provocation of the police in this area, but in fact, in line with the kind of rhetoric you saw a couple of bullet points above, this is a decisive move by the German counter-revolution on a national scale, and counter-revolution seen not in the sense of just German social democracy in the existing regime, and the police and the army don't get involved, but in that sense too, but also wider paramilitary forces, etc. And so you kind of get this situation where there's an artificial drive to push things forward, faking of kidnappings of worker militants, arms depots blown up, trains derailed, as we saw in the first slide. We'll come and look at one of the main guys behind that. And in order to create the impression of reprisals, blowing up, kind of a scorched earth policy of blowing up some of the workers' movement's own strongholds, like cooperative buildings, etc. So this is where things start to get a bit strange and get a bit complicated. And so, yes, as I said, the plan was to create an impression of a national counter-revolution. And then on the 23rd of March, Ebert, using Article 48, the President Ebert, again, SPD, using the Presidential Powers Article 48, invokes a state of emergency, state of siege in the region, and also in Hamburg. I won't talk about Hamburg today because it kind of goes beyond the remit of this talk, but Hamburg really, in a nutshell, is the only other region of Germany that sees substantial action following this kind of approach, right? So there's that. The army is not deployed, as I said, and the historiography is kind of split on this, but basically I think a consensus, to the extent one can speak of a consensus, is that moving in the army would actually only play into the hands of the insurrectionaries, and it might be the case then that it won't just be the communist influenced workers or the communist workers that are rising, but they may be able then to win over others. It should be said at this point as well that some of the strikes in the region at this time are characterized by people being pulled out of factories and threatened, etc. So non-communist workers, because the whole emphasis was, we've got to get this action kind of at all costs, and that got a little bit messy at times. The strike, I think, at its height, the strike movement encompasses about 120,000 different people in and around the kind of key factories of this industrial region. But in terms of, pushing it onto some kind of armed uprising for the final decisive victory for the world revolution, to quote Die Rote Fahne, there's only about 3,000 workers engaged in armed struggle. Again, these figures have to be taken with a pinch of salt, but you can see the kind of discrepancy, the kind of divergence between the consciousness and commitment of the different forces involved. And then 24th of March, KPD leadership called for a national general strike, but this, as I said before, is not heeded beyond central Germany and in Hamburg, and that it breaks down there too. There's a day-long movement led largely by unemployed workers in Hamburg, but that also fizzles out. And what essentially you have then is that the police ramps up the repression and kind of clears out the workers from the factories that they're occupying, etc. To the extent that they are doing that. The line of works, we saw a picture of it in a previous slide on the 29th of March. That was kind of the bastion of it. The workers actually made a tank when they were occupying that factory in that time. But that's defeated. That's cleared out by the police. Huge reprisals, arrests, deaths, etc., etc. We'll talk about in a bit more detail in a second. But the defeat becomes increasingly obvious. Notwithstanding that, though, only in the beginning of April the 1st, as the KPD leadership concede defeat and recognize that the strike now should be called off. It hasn't had been taken up by the masses of the workers, only in its strongholds, and even then with problems. And I think one of the factors behind that kind of delay is that they're trying to save face slightly, because, as we'll see in a second, the German Communist Party is kind of riven with factional tension at this point, and to withdraw would be to play into the hands of those who they see as their rivals in the party. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. But now, just to say, if you are using the chat, I can't see that at the moment, but I'll try and look later on. It's not so if you're writing to me, I'll check them later on, because I'm looking at my screen. Okay, so the causes, I briefly alluded to them earlier on. The Prussian police and provocation. That guy there giving a speech is Otto Hersing of the SPD, the Reichsbanner Schwarz-Rot-Gold, which was kind of the paramilitary organization of the SPD that stood for, as you can see on the left, that was its banner, the German nation, the Weimar Constitution, etc. And in the bottom left there, I think that's actually from Halle Merseburg, workers being led away by these armed troops that have moved into the region. So that's a kind of blurred picture of them as well, moving into the region. And so what causes this provocation? What's the motivations behind it from the standpoint of the Prussian government, the SPD, and its considerations? Well, there's several factors. Certainly, since Halle in 1920, the administration in Prussia is coming under pressure, also particularly from industrial interest, to kind of sort out this region and get a hold of it, which they claim is getting out of control. They try different things to spy on and police, quite literally, in the factories, the workers. But again, there's so much organization, so much strength there that they find it difficult to crack down. So there's constant appeals to the regime, the SPD-led government, to say, look, do something about this region. It's out of control. What can we do? And again, the role of chance, reconstructing the past. Something quite significant happens on the 13th of March. With the KAPD, with the Communist Workers' Party of Germany, we'll talk about later on. But there's a failed bomb plot on the Berlin Victory column, and some people say that the police trace this back to central Germany and to activists of the KPD in central Germany. Some say that's kind of just a pretext, but whichever is true, it doesn't really matter, because in terms of what came next, it did provide the pretext for the SPD loyal forces to crack down on central Germany. Also, one of the reasons given for this move is that the Comintern is sending emissaries to Berlin, which is indeed the case. And that's kind of how this is packaged. We need to do something. There's the threat of a communist revolution here, and steps are being taken to that. Look what almost happened to the Victory Tower in Berlin, etc., etc. So there's repression. And that's when the tide starts to turn, conducted, of course, under the pretext of law and order and preventing looting, but clearly a challenge to the communist movement in central Germany. As I alluded to before, Hersing's announced stationing of troops takes place on exactly the same day, the first day of the two-day extraordinary meeting of the KPD leadership. In terms of the local SPD influence members, the 70-odd thousand people that voted for them in the Halle Merseburg region, that's an interesting thing to look at about how they responded. They weren't particularly happy with the actions of the administration and their own administration, but nor, as time would tell, when it came to the March events themselves, were they particularly happy with some of the actions of the left either. So that's one of the reasons why they weren't drawn into the struggles en masse. In order to have a look at so that's factor one, is the police provocation moving into central Germany. But these events and these actions, these decisions cannot be separated from developments within the Communist Party either. By the way, this isn't the Communist Party leadership, this is the parliamentary fraction, and two people who will be important to subsequent developments are Clara Zetkin, sat in the front row towards the left, and top right, Paul Fröhlich, who you may have heard of as the biographer of Rosa Luxemburg. You may have read that book. They become quite significant in subsequent events. So this is the next factor, the next factor behind these events, the KPD moving from the so-called open letter of January 1920 to the theory of the offensive. And this can in many ways be bound up with the rise and fall of a man called Paul Levi, who in many ways was the most significant leader of German communism after Luxemburg, Liebknecht, and Jogache. He takes up the organization in a time of crisis and repression, and kind of manages to steer the organization away from putschist adventures following January 1919, away from kind of minority actions, towards a serious approach to the workers' movement as a whole, including social democracy. And under his leadership, for example, the KAPD, who we'll talk about later, they're a group of leftists in the party that reject parliamentarism, that reject work in trade unions, etc. He kicks them out. Under his leadership, they're thrown out. They form the KAPD. And the orientation instead is towards social democracy, particularly towards independent social democracy, the USPD. And in many ways, that strategy pays off in October 1920, when, as I said, a huge amount of independent social democrats that are pro-Moscow come over and join the Communist Party, making it a mass organization. To the masses, the open letter is based on, that was one of the cornerstones of his leadership in January 1920, based on experiences that I think metal workers in particular had made in Stuttgart, where they would try and organize alongside social democrats in unions, etc., non-communist workers for the struggles for their rights, for better working rights, for better conditions, etc., and to strengthen the united organizations of the working class. And again, that had that paid off in some ways, was successful, and as many other people have shown, we won't go into that now, in a sense fed into and in many ways informed the so-called United Front policy developed by Comintern at the Third Congress. But a number of developments that are quite complex to summarize occur, which lead to his sidelining as a leader. He was a co-leader with Ernst Däumig from the USPD left, who joined the KPD. There's a number of things going on. Levi wasn't particularly happy with the line adopted, or the policy adopted by Comintern towards the Italian Socialist Party. And splitting that to form the Italian Communist Party. He agreed with the split, but he didn't agree with taking Serrati's forces along with that split, who he likened more to the USPD left than the USPD right. There's a whole hoo-ha about that, and one of the factors here is that Karl Radek, who was the German specialist of the Bolsheviks and the Communist International, was not at all keen on this line, and made sure that it was carried through in the German party, the split according to how it happened, not how Levi wanted it. And there was a very small vote. I think by 2 votes, it was agreed that the Comintern policy had been correct, and then there's that kind of leads to the sidelining of Levi initially, and others such as Clara Zetkin, who's significant in these affairs too. Now, that can't be seen in isolation, because the overlaying that struggle is a conception of Levi's leadership, again quoting Radek here, that it's become possibilist and quietist. So this orientation towards social democracy, the mass of the workers of social democracy who still vote social democracy, despite all that it's done and all that it will do in the name of socialism or in the name of Marxism, whatever. There's a disquiet amongst that. So these two, it's hard to tell where the one stops and the other begins, but these factors kind of overlap and feed into this struggle against his leadership. As Radek puts it, we need a good leadership now, and that's the what's known as the left, the new left leadership. So to move away from this idea of an orientation around reforms with social democracy to strengthen the position of the Communist Party, to win more people to its banner, to win over the masses, to rally the masses, and more towards, well, actually, given how fluid this period is in Weimar Germany, given that there's so much going on, it's actually more incumbent upon the KPD to do its own actions, to establish its own momentum, and that will be the best way of the party growing. It's called the theory of the offensive. Again, complicated history, but that's the nature of these things. And so while Levy's leadership was characterized by this kind of anti-putschist approach following the January days of 1919, where the so-called Spartacus uprising is brutally suppressed, there's kind of been a turn away from that now towards the theory of the offensive. And I briefly sketched it out here. These are some of the people behind it: Heinrich Brandler, Ernst Thalheimer, Paul Fröhlich, who we saw above. They see that, and I think they honestly see this, that the nature of the period is such, with the reparations crisis, with French troops occupying the Ruhr, Düsseldorf, and Duisburg, possible conflict between Germany and Poland over the settlement of the territories, the borders. And Brandler even talks of a UK-US war. That's their mindset at this point. And they say, well, look, given all this is going on, we need to change our approach. We can't just have this patient strategy of building alongside others and winning people to our banner. But one thing that's worth saying, if you look at they're incomplete, the minutes, but if you look at the reports of the minutes of this meeting on the 16th and 17th, one of the things that is striking is that whilst there's an increased tendency towards maximalism, completing the world revolution, all this kind of stuff, it actually remains relatively kind of hot air and devoid of actual content and real plans in terms of, we do this on this date, but it's more a question of, we need to make sure the masses' energy is unravel as much as possible. Who would be against that? But then the news of the police settlement in central Germany comes, and that kind of then says, okay, now things are happening. Maybe this is the time. And I mentioned earlier about how conflicts were artificially created in order to create the impression of this heightening of tension and the necessity for revolutionary action and armed uprisings, etc. That is also implicit within some of the arguments of the lefts in the party at this time around the theory of the offensive. So Thalheimer, we must create conflicts, incite the security police and all counter-revolutionary elements. If we succeed in doing so, then there will be clashes. These have never hindered our strength. And here in bold cap part 2, if you want to try and understand what they're getting at, they're trying to say, well, look, if we can force the right to move, if we can force the reaction to get going, then that may work out to our benefit, because instead of then working with the SPD and the USPD forces around demands, reforms, etc., that are absolutely necessary to the growth of the working class movement, actually, a bit like in the Cap Putsch, we'll be marching alongside them over the question of state power. That's the idea, right? So there's this kind of thing. Well, we can incite. It's perfectly legitimate to do that as a revolutionary tactic, because in the past that worked out so well for us. That's the idea. It is, again, complicated, but there may even be two concepts of the offensive within the KPD leadership at this time. The first one, which is more, if we provoke things, we pose the question of power directly, and that can be in our favor. And then a more guarded approach, Radek partly, is more along this line, which is, okay, we have to realize that the situation is so pregnant with change, is changing so quickly, that we do need a shift away. We will need to do our own initiatives, but we don't necessarily, that doesn't mean then, tomorrow going and inciting the right or challenging for power, etc. So there's the shades here as well, that should be stated. And then yes, the news of the police invasion arrives. I mentioned this briefly before, but it is just worth going through this. These are incredibly difficult discussions to reconstruct on one level. The minutes are incomplete, and as we'll see in a second, the accounts and the memoirs of those involved, particularly someone like Paul Fröhlich, to me seem full of holes and slightly self-serving, and therefore one-sided and false. So it is just worth, I guard my comments slightly here in terms of what I'm saying, because these are complicated matters. Third factor, the role of the Executive Committee of Communist International and the Turkistanis, that's a phrase by Paul Levi, not me, to refer to Bela Kun, he's in that picture there, I should say, the leader of the Hungarian Revolution, Bela Kun. Kun, Pagani, and Goralski, I think all three of them are Hungarian, certainly Hungarian, two of them are. As was noted by the Prussian police and the Prussian administration, they are sent to Germany in early spring 1921 to shape things up a little bit, to make sure that the line on Italy and the split in the Italian Socialist Party goes through, but also to achieve fusion, political unity with the Communist Workers' Party of Germany, which again, Levy was dead against. His whole career in some ways as leader of the KPT was defined against that prospect and against that move. But it should also be said, and that becomes clear in the events of the March action, that some of them also take liberties in this whole scenario, without the approval of the ECCI, and they do so kind of on their own back, and we'll see some examples of it here. Goralski, for example, is on the ground in the Halle-Merseburg region at this time, and there's a lot of kind of weird things going on behind the scenes, unofficially working with KAPD organizations, military units, strike committees that kind of circumvent the existing workers' councils, etc., etc. And so particularly the role of Kuhn and Goralski is quite shady. Also interesting is that when it comes to the KPD leadership reporting the fateful meeting in March, is that they do not let the membership know that there were actually representatives of the Comintern there. And again, you wonder why that would be the case, given that their presence is known. It could have been, again, one of the some of the things that some of the steps they were taking to impose what they were trying to do, as I say, not always in line with the ECCI, actually. So it's worth stressing that I'm not here saying this is a Moscow plot, right? Where, okay, let's get three of our guys in the German Central Committee and let's form let's make a revolution. That is unfortunately what a lot of West German historiography on the KPD, on the German Communist Party, says, and you can see why, because that's what the communists do, don't they? They organize putches, and they do it from outside. But it's also worth reminding, and Mike Munir gave a talk on this a few weeks ago, developments in Russia are important because some of those active in the ECCI, Zinoviev, Bukharin, they think that, okay, we're not keen on NEP. NEP is a massive gamble. We need some kind of help from Germany. We need to move things forward in Germany. So there is that, again, not dishonest or in that sense unhealthy desire to move things forward, but there is a certain pressure there, and that feeds into the theory of the offensive somewhat. Bukharin and Goralski, again, were very much advocates of the idea of maneuvering workers into action. Radek had a slightly more nuanced take that was based around the open letter and more ambitious actions by the KPD itself. So you can't really talk of a kind of monolithic approach in the ECCI to these questions, but I do think that the role of Kuhn and Goralski in particular is a negative one. It's also worth saying, again, this wire pulling, this secrecy, these machinations behind closed doors. Bela Kun meets privately with Clara Zetkin, because Zetkin, very important figure in the German communist movement, close to Levi politically, supportive of him generally, his general approach and his ideas on Italy, and against the theory of offensive, against the New Left leadership. And she says that she actually reports back to the party and says she will not meet this guy alone anymore because of his rudeness, the kind of the nature of it, the wild nature of his suggestions. And just to give an impression of this, I haven't translated this, sorry, but I'll quickly do it. This is Bela Kun writing to Lenin, and he says, well, as far as what old comrade Zetkin claims, I've only got the following to say. The old woman is suffering from senile dementia and is living proof that the Flag did the right thing with his wife. And that's a reference to Lafargue and Laura Lafargue committing suicide when they felt that they couldn't contribute to the party anymore, and that they were suffering, etc. So not particularly nice letter. Lenin lost patience with Bela Kun on several occasions, and partly as a result of this whole March stuff. But that's a separate point. I would say this though, as well, as much of a bastard as Bela Kun comes across as in these matters, we cannot overlook, and we shouldn't overlook, the structural changes, the tensions, the underlying factors that are forcing some of these changes, and the kind of desperation that it sometimes involves. But it does get quite nasty, and it's, as I say, there's a certain bit of cloak and dagger around it as well. So yes, so you've got this third factor in now, that some in the ECCI reps, in particular reps in Germany, they kind of not only welcome this move by Herzing to move in the police into central Germany, but they kind of see it now, maybe this is the revolutionary horizon holding up, and Goralski played a certain role. The final factor in all of this, the role of the KAPD, that's not a very good one, but this is a 1919 what do you call it, electoral poster, well, a non-electoral poster, you call it, I suppose, anti-electoral poster by the KAPD. It says you shouldn't vote. Parliamentarism is the democratic stage for the rule of capital. Parliament and its republic protect the capitalist sharks and kill the working class. So that's the kind of approach of there. Übt boycott means don't vote, boycott the elections. So that's the kind of where the KAPD are coming from. Workerist, boycottist shunned official unions and built its own organizations that then tended to split quite a lot, but the AAUD was their main one. As I said, origins in the KPD, expelled by Levy in October 1919 in Heidelberg. And the organization was accepted as a representative of German communism by the Comintern, much to Levy's chagrin. So in the second Congress, Levy kind of threatens to take the German KPD out of there at one point, but he's kind of convinced to do otherwise. And the KPD is brought online. That doesn't last for long. I think they're out by the third Congress, maybe even before the third Congress. And certainly the people, the main people involved are recognize that as a mistake. Lenin certainly does. But the KPD is very important in these events in two ways. One of its leaders, or people, one of the people close to it is key in pushing things forward. His name is Max Herz. We'll discuss him in a second. But also it kind of acts as a constant left-wing ginger group, as it were, to the KPD. It's constantly, so you've got these tensions, the theory of the new theory of the offensive, but you've also got this left-wing counterweight in central Germany itself, which is pulling and drawing, is putting pressure on from the left to escalate these actions, when many voices locally are saying, well, actually, can we really go through with this? And they see it as not a defensive struggle, which I think at the start this was, and was generally in that sense a good move. It probably should have then been called off, but they want to escalate it into a struggle for power, which doesn't even work in the region, let alone Germany as a whole. This is Hertz, nice picture of him, 1889 to 1933. I translated the title of a book recently written on him. He was called An Arsonist and Revolutionary, the German Robin Hood, Che Guevara, an Anarchist, the Red General, His Life and Struggle. He earns a bit of a name for himself in 1920 in the Kapp Lutwitz Putsch, for his kind of brave actions in organizing small groups of workers to attack the counter-revolutionaries, etc. Bank robber, train derailer, fighter against counter-revolution. So again, the derailed train that we saw at the start may have been the work of him or his close allies. There is some dispute whether he was actually a member of the KAPD, but certainly the people he was organizing were workers of that ilk and that approach. Establishes his own workers' fighter troops to rob banks and launched attacks against the police in Eisleben. In Eisleben, there's pretty protracted conflict between the workers and the police. He was arrested for his role in this and sentenced to life, but managed to escape in 1928 and died. I think he drowned in the Soviet Union in 1933. Aftermath. There's a picture of an arrested worker in Bavaria, I think, so it's not particularly relevant to this talk, but I thought it would be useful to throw in. Just under 200 dead, many injured, and thousands are arrested or imprisoned. The Communist Party loses, again, estimates vary, but it would be around a quarter of its members, 100,000 activists in total. One positive you could say is that they founded Die Rote Hilfe, Red Aid, which was established as a group to support arrested militants, which would supply legal aid and financial assistance to those in trouble. If any of you have seen the German TV series that's currently on, Babylon Berlin, in the recent series, there's a big feature about Die Rote Hilfe, which is quite interesting, and how it worked. And it's obviously leads to a huge fallout, both in Germany and internationally. Lenin writes to Zinoviev, the final analysis of things shows that Levy was politically right in many ways. The thesis of Thalheimer and Bela Kuhn, as we discussed above, the theory of the offensive, is politically totally false. Phrases and beer attending playing the radical leftist. I would also argue, I haven't looked at this in enormous detail. I need to go and look again at the Third Congress. But I would say that the assessment overall is an ambivalent one. In the sense that it's kind of it's seen as a step forward, as a manifestation of the willingness of the German workers to struggle and their bravery, etc., etc. But on the other, it's also then seen as a kind of problematic implementation of the theory of the offensive, so-called, and there's the move more towards the kind of united front approach that I discussed in relation to Levy. What makes it worse in a sense is that the leadership, the original leadership that was replaced in February around Levy and Zetkin, its main voice, Levy, is no longer there. Levy splits to form his own group, which eventually ends up in the USPD and eventually ends up back in German social democracy. And Lenin, who held Levy in very high regard until that point, when discussing this, I can't remember, it's quoted in Trotsky somewhere, and Lenin says, the Germans lost their heads, but at least Levy had a head to lose. Now that was his kind of assessment of it all. But Lenin in correspondence offers Levy the chance to come back in because he thinks that will be a very important move to come back into the Communist Party, to have influence again maybe as an editor, as a writer, and then work back through the party, but that doesn't happen. Zetkin, in many ways, then becomes one of the leading figures around the party in reasserting that kind of older approach around Levy. And then there's a very messy and protracted kind of struggle over the role played by Levy. So, for example, Levy publishes a book, a very good pamphlet in many ways, called Our Way, or Our Path Against Putschism, which quotes Marx and Engels on revolution and uprising and the need to win a majority to the cause. And also he does a reprint or I think he prints actually maybe the first time Rosa Luxemburg's critical prison writings on the Russian Revolution, and that's when things start to get messy. And this gulf opens up that kind of continues then long beyond his or Zetkin's life in the form of historiography on these questions, the split between, you know, the Western normal sensible Marxism and the Russian barbaric kind or whatever. And one of the problems immediately, if you look at the April 2nd edition of the Die Rote Fahne, showing that few lessons have been learned, it says, we have called off this battle, but the whole situation calls out for new struggle. So, you know, next time, you know, hopefully soon we'll do it properly. And it's symptomatic, I think, of the fact that the March action, the series of events in March 1921 really weren't taken on board. The German Communist Party is constantly then flipping subsequently between left and right, and I think that's partly as a result of the defeats of this and the whole idea of the theory of the offensive. What about what other communists said? There's a whole literature on this. Again, it's kind of submerged in this huge polemical dispute between Levy and his supporters and the Comintern and their supporters, etc. But if we look at Fröhlich, for example, who we met earlier on, author of the Bio of Luxembourg, which is a good book, he's key to this crisis meeting in March and what's going on in the change of leadership in the KPD part of the left. Theory of the offensive, drive forward the masses, provoke escalation. Those are the kinds of things he's saying. And again, when it comes to Bavaria, which is a whole separate talk for itself, he is of the view that, you know, that the Freikorps should be provoked into doing something, so that then the path will, so the theory goes, open up for us to advance and do our thing. I reviewed in the weekly work a long time ago, I think maybe 2012, 2013, his memoirs in the radical camp. And there's the section has recently been published by Jacobin. I can put the link in the chat, the section on the March action. And when I read that book and when I reviewed it, I was very impressed with Fröhlich, actually. But now having a look at what he writes on the March action, I must say I'm far less convinced than I think I've been. At best, it's got more holes than Swiss cheese, and at worst, it's actually, you could say, it's a kind of rather dishonest self-justification of his role. He's far too soft on Bela Kuhn. He's very harsh on Levy, so he points out to all the things that Levy did wrong in terms of not staying in the party, of going off in a huff, etc., of publishing his pamphlet without consulting anyone, but then doesn't actually say that, to all intents and purposes, many of the things that happened to a certain extent vindicated Levy in his approach, and the Comintern adopted approach that was closer to that of Levy at the third Congress. Doesn't mention the KAPD, which is remarkable given that what we've looked at and its centrality here, the fact that there were emissaries from Comintern sent to unite these organizations, and then talk of, you know, objective conditions. So this time the objective conditions weren't right, but maybe in the future they will be, kind of thing, which I think it completely dodges the political problems with the theory of the offensive as applied in that time. Otto Kilian, a kind of less known guy, died in a concentration camp in 1945. He became a Trotskyist, I think in 1933, early 30s anyway. Maybe I can't exactly remember, but he does become a supporter of Trotsky at one point. And this is a pamphlet produced by the KPD on the right in November 1921. He writes a preface to it, and I've just translated that preface, so hopefully I'll get it in the weekly worker at some point too. And not because it's a brilliant text, I have to say, but it's because it's an interesting, again, reflection, semi-justification for what happened. It's called White Terror in Central Germany, The Truth About the March Struggles. And what this pamphlet is a stenographic report of the Prussian State Parliament's commission in October 1921, which was held to investigate and look into some of these events, given the huge fallout, the deaths, the arrests, etc. And Kilian writes a preface, and it's quite remarkable, actually. He finds himself vindicated, and the KPD clearly, with some reason, sees itself as vindicated by saying, look, now we have the evidence you know, the Herzing, Severing, and all the kind of the key players in the regime have given evidence here. And not only that, we've seen evidence from people on the ground themselves, some of whom did not support the communists. And he says, actually, because he was a member of the Prussian state parliament, he said, when we chose our witnesses, when we selected witnesses and proposed witnesses for the commission, we tried to avoid communists as much as possible, to kind of, you know, avoid the suspicion that we were kind of changing this. But they see themselves as vindicated because just due to the extremely horrific nature of what went on in these days, right? And for him, he says, look, this was nothing to do with a communist attempt to take power. This was nothing to do with, you know, a calling for the victory of the proletarian revolution. This was a provocation. Well, as we've seen, it clearly was a provocation, right? But at the same time, it was intermingled, and the response of the communist movement was a flawed one, precisely because it tried to push these things forward artificially. Just a quote. Hopefully, I've got a few more minutes. Is that okay, Stan? Yeah.
Yeah, you carry on.
Okay. So just to give an impression of what was said at this commission held in October 21, Killian writes, the shootings of those people while escaping arrest, classic formulation used also in the murder of Luxembourg and Leibniz, has been shown to be vicious, premeditated murders by assassins. One worker had a revolver pressed into his hand with which he was forced to shoot himself. A second, who refused to go along with this, had his skull sliced in two. The Dusseldorf watch of Master Heim, or Heine to call him by his correct name, made martyrs of the prisoners in the Leuna silo, which we talked about, day and night. The officers took great pleasure in doing so. And the bestiality did not even stop at the dead. Although it seems almost unbelievable, it is a fact, as testified by a bourgeois doctor, i.e. a non-communist doctor, before the investigating committee, that after being shot, a member of the protective police cut open the torso of the Worker Problenz in Schraplau and tore out his intestines. Herzing, yes, the Social Democrat politician, expressed his gratitude for this barbarity. So while, you know, we also have to put these things in context somewhat, but like I say, as with Fröhlich, this is a particular one-sided justification, I would say, or a kind of minimalizing the lack of an informed approach to what had happened at the time. Interestingly enough as well, Killian was actually very critical of the march action at the time. He was on the ground in Halle, and he was one of these regional leaders that said to the national leadership, are you sure about this? Is this really what you want to do? But yeah, they put together some documents as well. They quote some of their own appeals in the local press and some of the things that they've written. And they say, look, looking at these documents, it's completely groundless, as some people say, that we try to invoke armed struggle. This did not even happen in Eisleben, where bloody battles nevertheless spontaneously broke out amongst the mass of the workers who were outraged by the provocation. You might remember Eisleben from before, and that's precisely where Max Herz and his armed bandits were running around. So it's not exactly the most accurate portrayal of Eisleben either necessarily, but interesting that these things exist. Just finally, without getting too kind of detailed about it, as I say, I'm very much at the start of looking into these things. It's a fascinating couple of weeks really in German politics and in working class politics more generally. I alluded to it before, but you know, West German historiography very much of the idea that this wasn't a response to a provocation. That was just the kind of the hook on which to peg one's politics, and those politics were being fed directly from Moscow via the emissaries into the German Communist Party. I think we've shown that that's not the case. It was far more complex than that. There were pushbacks. There were different conceptions of the theory of the offensive, both in the Comintern and in the German Party and the German Party leadership itself, let alone the fact that there was so much opposition to that line, both at all levels of the party and certainly on the ground. GDR, again, this is a broad brushstroke impression rather than, you know, this is the way to look at it, but generally seen following Killian and Fröhlich to a certain extent, although Fröhlich has got a different history, following these things, that this was no putsch, but it was a heroic defensive struggle against the white police action going into the white reaction, going into the heartlands of the German proletariat and tearing things up. And that's generally how it's seen there. Brouet, who's kind of the go-to guy, Trotskyist historian, wrote his PhD thesis, huge book on the German Revolution. What's interesting about Brouet's book is that he has loads of detail on the aftermath, the fallout, the political discussions in Germany, but particularly at the level of Comintern. But there's a lot less on the events themselves. And I think, having put together this talk and struggled with trying to reconstruct everything, I think there's a reason for that. There are some source issues. Sigrid Koch-Baumgarten, 1987 study. Again, there's very little in English. Most of the stuff is German. More nuanced on the events themselves. So in that sense, kind of fills in some of the gaps in Brouet. But I would argue is problematic in three main respects. First of all, she sees these events as kind of sealing the KPD's dependence on Comintern. So whereas the kind of standard, certainly the Trotskyist conception would be the Bolshevization of the party starts in 24, 25, and then you get Stalinization, Tailman as the new leader, et cetera, et cetera. She says, well, look, no, this is, while it's not the case that this is a putsch initiated by Moscow, some of these things that happen that I talked about, the secret meetings, the plottings, the secret committees, etc., they seal the KPT's dependence on Comintern, which I think goes too far. For example, she says, well, look, the Comintern, the executive committee of Comintern was always writing open letters in the German communist press, correcting the line of the Communist Party that had been taken. But I don't see that, and I'm sure most communists here will not see that as an example of sealing the KPD's dependence on Comintern. Also, again, this is kind of following Levy when he breaks with communism. It's kind of informed by that Cold War narrative about the hyper-centralization of Bolshevism and how it can't be applied to Western societies, as predicted by Rosa Luxemburg. We all know the story. But I'm being harsh because it's a very good book actually, but it's just that kind of backdrop. And yes, the other thing I mentioned, the particular nature of the workforce in central Germany, young, more precariously employed, lower wages, etc., less union organization, etc. She says that, well, basically the reason why the KPD was so strong in that central Germany was precisely because of that. There was no material basis, as she puts it, for reformist SPD type politics, which again is for me a most questionable statement. Finally, I've said that in this talk I'm very much at the beginning of something, and this is certainly not the last word. What's also interesting is that when it comes to reconstructing these events, which I still think is nowhere near complete. We don't have a complete image of it. One of the things to note is that the local archives were previously based in the GDR, so in East Germany, because that's where Halle Merseburg is. But they've since become available, so it would be interesting to see if there's new material there to have a look at and whether it changes the picture. Also, since then, of course, there are a lot more materials from the Comintern Executive Committee itself, which may or may not provide more of a detailed image of the nuances and the shades and the differences than I've been able to do here. But that would obviously go beyond the remit of the talk. And then, yeah, I've just got some, sorry, I'm taking a lot of time. Just some kind of ideas, again, not really strong conclusions, but holding back or even retreating does not always imply a kind of reformist, quietist, passive fatalism. I think that would be one of the things to say. Nor does always pushing forward imply revolutionary consistency or strategy. I made this point before on several occasions when writing about the KPD, but I would also say that it should be, even though the situation was not propitious to a national uprising of the workers in solidarity with the central German beating heart of communism, I do think there's a problem pretty much from the get-go with the German communist left, in that it doesn't really have a national strategy, let alone an international one. It clearly orientates towards Moscow, and it sees itself as part of the international communist movement. But if you look at events in Germany, revolutionary events, they tend to be isolated pockets of uprisings that are then seen as, okay, this is the way that we can go forward, while in another part of the country, you know, the peasantry are in no way affected by, or very little affected by communist propaganda, or the right wing is on the march, etc. And, you know, you can see that January 1919 Berlin, March 21 in Saxony, in Halle, October 1923, again around these kind of states, right? And the kind of national aspect is missing. You could also look at Bavaria going its own way with its own politics. So I think that's a more general issue. And I would say that the problem of leftism has a long prehistory in the German workers' movement, the revolutionary movement. I mentioned January 1919, is that our program, Karl, as Rosa Luxemburg says to Karl Liebknecht, when there's this Spartacist so-called uprising. Even in Prussia in 1910, the idea that we could just keep elevating the struggle in the state of Prussia, and that will lead us to, you know, constantly to go forward, I think is problematic. And just lastly, on the role of the ECCI, as I said, in opposition to those like Baumgarten, we're not yet dealing with the Stalinization and the instrumentalization of the Germanist Communist Party as a kind of plaything of Moscow. But there are some worrying steps in that direction. Militarized party, the vanguard, substituting for the masses, almost to the point where you can fake attacks on the left to advance your cause. Secret meetings, withholding information from members, etc., etc. I think is, you know, they're milestones towards that. It's not the seal. It's not that the fate is sealed, but I think there are very worrying developments even at this time. And the fact that you know, the Turkestanis, so-called, as Levi calls them, for their role that they played in the Caucasus, etc. The fact that they can have so much influence and to a certain extent be so unaccountable in that process is a worrying one. The last point I'll make, what is also interesting is that the many of the KPD rank and file really thought that this was nonsense. It's kind of interesting, one of those alternative histories, if there'd been time for the party to have a proper factional hoo-ha over this question, and a new party congress, for example, without Herzing marching the troops into central Germany, it's quite likely that the theory of the offensive would have been defeated. It was not popular, and you can see that just by the way these ideas panned out, these events panned out in March. And I think that one of the, or certainly some of the things I'm reading, that one of the reasons why members were reluctant to criticize and speak out and organize was this kind of feeling, well, okay, this is going wrong, but Moscow will somehow sort it out for us. And I think that's also worth noting in the whole development of German communism and the place of these events in it as an international movement. Sorry for taking so much time. I will stop there.
Yeah, no,